Dr. Tom Reeves was a man who knew how to make an entrance. With his sharp black suit, perfectly gelled hair, and the smug confidence of someone who'd spent the past decade on the cusp of world-changing scientific breakthroughs, it was clear he had a particular fondness for himself. He was, after all, the lead researcher at Heisenberg Labs, the company credited with unlocking the most important mystery of the 21st century: quantum genetics. Today, he was on live television, explaining to the world how his team had mapped what he called the quantum genetic code, a new layer of information encoded in human DNA, transmitted through quantum particles, and previously undiscovered. He had called it the key to understanding how humans had evolved, how their bodies and minds worked on the most fundamental level. It was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the breakthrough that would immortalize him, but today, instead of being hailed as a genius, Reeves would become something else entirely. He was mid-sentence, talking about the implications of manipulating quantum genetic data to enhance human evolution, when it happened. The power in the studio flickered, and a strange, metallic hum filled the room. The lights dimmed, flickered, then went out entirely. For a brief moment, the screen went black. The studio audience, usually accustomed to smooth broadcasts, murmured in confusion. "Don't worry, folks," Dr. Reeves said, laughing nervously, "just a small glitch in the matrix. Happens when you're working with cutting-edge technology." The audience chuckled, but there was something in the air now, a quiet, unspoken unease that hadn't been there before. He tried to ignore it, continuing with his rehearsed spiel about how they were on the verge of genetically enhancing humans through quantum particles, how this technology would usher in a new era of health, intelligence, and even immortality. Then came the first report that it wasn't on the screen. It was in the studio itself. A woman in the front row stood up, her eyes wide. She looked confused. Then her hand flew to her mouth as if she was about to vomit. In the next instant, she collapsed. "Is she okay?" someone from the crew asked, rushing to her side. But before anyone could answer, the woman opened her eyes, stared directly at Dr. Reeves, and said, "It's already begun." The words seemed to echo, too loud and too clear. The audience fell silent. Suddenly, the woman began to twitch, her body convulsing as if her internal organs were being rearranged. It wasn't normal. Her face contorted in a way that suggested her bones were changing, shifting. People screamed, but Dr. Reeves was frozen. The light in the room flickered again, a blinding white flash filled the space, and just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The woman was now standing. She looked different. Her eyes were glowing faintly, and her posture had changed, too, as though her body had recalibrated itself to a new and unfamiliar standard. She looked at the audience, at Dr. Reeves, and smiled. "I'm better now," she said, her voice tinged with an accent none of them had heard before. The whole thing was so surreal that it almost felt like a dream. But there was nothing dreamlike about the panic that spread like wildfire across the studio. Security rushed in, people were shouting, and the broadcast cameras continued rolling, capturing it all. Dr. Reeves took a step forward. "What just happened?" "Quantum infection," the woman answered in a voice far too calm for the situation. "You unlocked something, Dr. Reeves. A quantum contagion. It's changing us. It's rewriting our genes." Before anyone could respond, a wave of dizziness overtook Dr. Reeves. He stumbled back, grasping the edge of a table for support. The air seemed to thicken around him, as though the very fabric of reality had warped. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but it didn't help. He saw things. Heard things. It was as if his mind was expanding, pulling in memories that weren't his own. His vision blurred, flickered images of people who hadn't been in the studio, places he hadn't visited. For a brief moment, it all stopped. And when he opened his eyes again, the world had changed. The woman, the infected woman, was now at the center of the room, her hands extended like a prophet delivering a message. She looked straight at him. Her expression softened, and she whispered, "We're already a part of it, Dr. Reeves. It's too late to stop it now." Dr. Reeves didn't hear the rest of her words. A headache that felt like the universe itself had split in two surged through him. His thoughts grew cloudy, then sharper, then scattered again. A flood of images hit him, almost too fast for him to process, then it stopped and everything clicked. The media would call it the quantum pandemic, and the world would never be the same again. Days passed. The world watched as more and more people began to show symptoms. Some exhibited strange abilities, superhuman strength, the ability to manipulate light, even telepathy. Others found themselves experiencing reality differently. Time felt warped, as though they were slipping between dimensions, but the most frightening change wasn't physical. It was genetic. Dr. Reeves, now back at Heisenberg Labs, stood in front of his team, all staring at the data they'd managed to collect from the virus. It wasn't a typical pathogen. It wasn't biological. The virus didn't work like bacteria or a standard virus. Instead, it seemed to be rewriting genetic code, reprogramming the very foundation of who people were. We've never seen anything like this, Dr. Reeves said, running a hand through his hair, exhausted. It's not just infecting people, it's changing their genes. Not just their present genes either, but future genes. It's altering the very blueprint of humanity. His assistant, Karen, stood beside him, looking equally worried. What does that mean? I don't understand. It means, Reeves said slowly, the virus isn't from here. It's not from our time. This virus is quantum. It's an agent of time, a vector for future humanity's genetic code. Somehow, it's tapping into a genealogical chain that spans across time, past, present, and future. Karen's eyes widened. You're saying this virus is rewriting history? Reeves nodded grimly. That's exactly what it's doing. The days that followed were a blur of discovery, panic, and confusion. The virus didn't just spread. It mutated fast. It started in small clusters, infecting the more vulnerable, the less prepared. But then it spread like wildfire, slipping into the atmosphere, carried by the very particles that had once been thought of as the stuff of quantum mechanics and science fiction. The more they studied it, the more they realized this wasn't just a virus, it was a signal. A genetic message embedded in quantum particles that could alter the course of human evolution. The infected weren't just experiencing mutations, they were receiving instructions, changing in ways that weren't random. It was as if the virus had a purpose. A grand design. Dr. Reeves had a terrifying thought. This virus wasn't a natural occurrence. It was a message from the future. A civilization from the far-flung future had somehow used quantum particles to send this virus back in time. The virus was altering human genetics to fit the future they wanted, a future that had already been mapped. A future where their own survival depended on controlling human evolution, and Dr. Reeves realized something worse. He had been the one who'd unknowingly triggered it. The truth hit him hard. The quantum particles in his work, his breakthrough, his crowning achievement, had somehow activated this chain reaction. His discovery had been the key, the catalyst, for the virus's introduction into the world. It wasn't just a scientific error or a freak accident. It was a plan. A plan that had started long before he ever realized it. Dr. Reeves stood in front of the large glass windows, staring out at the city skyline. His mind was racing, trying to keep up with the implications of everything that had happened over the past few days. The virus, the genetic changes, the people who were beginning to transform, it was all too much to process. But the realization that kept pounding in his mind was that the virus had come from the future. The future. Somehow, someway, his own work had triggered this catastrophe. He tried to focus on the data in front of him, screens filled with genetic sequences, quantum signatures, and atmospheric readings. But it all blurred together, a maze of incomprehensible patterns. He had seen it before. He'd seen the changes in the infected, the sudden bursts of intelligence, the mutations, the glimpses of future lives they spoke of with eerie certainty. And then there was the woman from the interview, the one who had spoken so calmly as the chaos erupted around them. He couldn't get her out of his head. Her voice, so strangely familiar, her eyes glowing with something that wasn't quite human. She wasn't just a victim. She was a messenger. And now he had to figure out what she had meant when she said, "We're already a part of it." Reeves rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. He needed answers. He needed to know what the hell was going on. The virus wasn't just rewriting human DNA, it was rewriting time itself. Every moment that passed felt like it was slipping through his fingers, as if reality itself were becoming unmoored. He turned away from the windows and walked over to the terminal. Karen, his assistant, was there, her face pale, eyes red from lack of sleep. She hadn't left his side since the broadcast, her loyalty never wavering, even though she was just as scared as he was. They had been working non-stop, trying to piece together the fragments of this disaster. Trying to stop it. "How's it looking?" he asked her, trying to keep his voice steady. Karen didn't answer right away. She typed something into the keyboard, then sighed. "The virus is evolving. It's not just a pathogen anymore. It's a transmission system, a way for the future to communicate with the past. The changes in the infected, they're not random mutations, Tom. They're structured. It's like they're receiving a signal. And the signal is rewriting their entire genetic blueprint. Not just now, but also before." Dr. Reeves frowned. "What do you mean before?" "Before," she said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "It's altering their ancestral genetics. People who are infected are beginning to show traits of their descendants, of humans who have evolved in the future. They're not just changing in the present. It's like they're becoming vessels for a future humanity." Reeves processed her words in silence, then nodded grimly. He'd suspected as much. The glimpses of memories from the future, the flashes of languages and places he didn't recognize, it all made sense now. The virus wasn't just spreading a new disease. It was transmitting data. Information. It was reprogramming people's genes and unlocking a future that had already been set in motion. But why? Karen asked, her voice low. Why would the future do this? Why would they want to change the past? "They're trying to save themselves," Reeves said, his voice more certain now. "The future humanity, they must be on the brink of extinction. This virus is their last-ditch effort to rewrite the past, to shape their own survival. They need to reshape our genetic code, to force humanity to evolve in a way that will guarantee their future. And in order to do that, they have to start with us." Karen looked horrified. "So they've been planning this all along?" Reeves nodded. "From the very beginning. I never saw it. My work, our research, it was the catalyst. The key. I unlocked the door. And now it's too late to shut it. Can we stop it?" Karen asked, her voice desperate. "Doctor." Reeves hesitated. Could they? Could they really stop something that had already begun altering the very foundation of human existence? It felt impossible. But then again, so did the virus itself. Nothing about this situation made sense anymore. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But we have to try." The next few days were a blur of frantic planning and sleepless nights. The virus spread faster than they could track it, infecting thousands, then millions. Some people were changing so quickly that it was impossible to keep up. Infected individuals began to display extraordinary abilities, heightened intelligence, telepathic connections, and strange, almost unnatural skills. The world was plunged into chaos, not knowing whether the infected were harbingers of humanity's future evolution or its ultimate destruction. Reeves and Karen had tried to isolate the source of the virus, but it was everywhere. They had tested hundreds of samples, running countless simulations, but the results were always the same. There was no stopping it. The virus was part of the quantum fabric of reality itself, embedded in the very particles that made up the universe. It wasn't a disease. It was a program then came the first true sign that the future was already here. A woman walked into Heisenberg Labs late one night. She was dressed in simple clothes, nothing fancy, but there was an intensity in her eyes that immediately unsettled Reeves. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. There was something about her presence that felt otherworldly. She walked straight into the lab, her gaze fixed on him, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Finally, she spoke. "You're the one who started it," she said, her voice low but firm. Reeves stood frozen. "What do you want?" She smiled, a smile that was both kind and terrifying. "What I want, Dr. Reeves, is for you to stop fighting what's already in motion. The changes are irreversible now. The timeline has been set. You're part of it. We all are." "Who are you?" Karen demanded. The woman tilted her head slightly, as though considering the question. "I'm someone who remembers," she said softly. "I remember a future where you're not just a scientist. You're something more. You're a key. You always have been." Reeves felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean by that?" "The virus, it's not just rewriting your genes. It's rewriting your memory. Your consciousness. Soon, you will remember things you've never lived. You will see futures that haven't happened yet. You will know things that you didn't know you knew." "Is that why they're changing?" Karen asked, her voice shaking. "Are they becoming like you?" The woman's smile deepened, and she nodded. "Yes. And soon, you will, too." Dr. Reeves felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The woman wasn't just an infected person. She was a messenger. She was part of the future. Part of the plan. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. In the weeks that followed, the world began to change in ways no one could have predicted. People grew more connected, more aware. They could hear each other's thoughts, feel each other's emotions, see flashes of the future. The infected were no longer just victims. They were leaders. They were the harbingers of a new world. And then, one day, it happened. The final wave. Dr. Reeves felt it in his bones. The world had shifted, irrevocably. The virus had completed its work. Humanity had evolved. The future had arrived. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it all settle around him. He had always thought of himself as a scientist, a man who sought knowledge, who pursued truth above all else. But now, he understood. He had never been in control. The future had always known what it was doing. And now, as the timeline was fully rewritten, he could only watch as humanity stepped into its new form. He didn't know what would come next. No one did. But as he felt his mind begin to expand, as he started to glimpse the echoes of futures yet to be, he realized that perhaps it didn't matter, because the future was already here. And it was us. Dr. Reeves could feel the pulse of the world shifting beneath his feet. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor in the air, like an electric charge, but then it grew stronger, more urgent. The world was changing. And yet, amidst all the transformation, there was a strange sense of calm that settled over him, like a deep, almost unnatural stillness. He turned to face Karen, who stood beside him, her face pale with exhaustion, her eyes filled with the same mix of fear and understanding that he saw in his own reflection. They were both infected, now changed in ways they still didn't fully comprehend. But in the silence between them, something profound passed. There was no longer the frantic panic that had accompanied the first days of the outbreak. Now, it was as if they had crossed some threshold into a new reality, a reality that neither of them could escape, no matter how hard they tried. "The time has come," Karen whispered. "It's here." Dr. Reeves said nothing, but he knew she was right. He could feel it in his bones. The timeline had shifted. He had glimpsed pieces of it, the fragmented flashes of future lives, of humanity's evolution, of the path that was unfolding. But the flashes had grown clearer, sharper. He could almost hear the whispers of 1,000 futures, all converging on this moment, pulling him forward, pulling everyone forward. There was no more resistance. No more questions. No more doubt. The door to the lab opened with a soft hiss, and the woman who had visited them earlier stepped inside again. This time, she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a dozen other people who looked like her, but somehow different. Their eyes glowed faintly, and there was an eerie calmness in the way they moved, as if they had already stepped outside the constraints of time and were now simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Reeves felt a shiver run down his spine. These were the true agents of the future, beings who had already transcended the past, who existed in multiple timelines at once. They weren't human, not anymore. But they carried with them the knowledge of what was to come. Is it done? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. Despite himself, the woman nodded. It's almost complete. The virus has done its work. The genetic modifications are locked in place. The timelines are now aligned. We are ready. Ready? Karen echoed, her voice hoarse with confusion. What does that mean? What happens now? Now, the woman said softly, her eyes locking with Dr. Reeves in a way that felt almost too intimate. We wait for the world to remember. The future isn't just something that happens. It's something that's always been. It's already in you, Dr. Reeves. In all of us. We're just uncovering it. Reeves swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of her words press down on him. We're just uncovering it. The future had already been set in motion. The changes weren't just happening to people, they were happening to the world itself. The quantum virus hadn't just altered their genetic code. It had made them vessels for a future that was already becoming reality. We're not just the carriers of this virus, he said slowly, his voice barely a whisper. We're the catalysts. The woman smiled, and for a moment, it was as if the room itself bent, as if time itself bent, folding into a place where the past and future existed simultaneously. Yes. You were always meant to be. The air around them thickened, heavy with the weight of inevitability. Reeves could feel it now, this strange resonance, this hum in the atmosphere. The future was here. And it was no longer an abstract concept. It was a presence, real and tangible, slipping into their minds like a slow tide. They could see it now. They could feel it. There was no escaping it. The change was happening to everyone, all at once. Do you feel it? Karen asked, her voice a mix of awe and dread. The memories? Reeves nodded, closing his eyes. The memories were coming faster now. Faces he didn't recognize, places he'd never been, emotions that weren't his own. The future was pouring into him, not as a distant possibility, but as a lived experience. He wasn't just seeing glimpses of what was to come. He was experiencing it. Don't fight it, the woman said gently. Let it come. The future will rewrite you as it has rewritten the world. Reeves opened his eyes, and the world had shifted again. He could feel it in his bones, in his skin. It was no longer just his mind that had expanded, it was his entire being. He was stepping into the future, piece by piece, as if he were dissolving into it. The quantum virus had unlocked something deep within him, something that transcended time itself, and then he understood, the future wasn't something that was simply coming. It was already here. It had always been here, waiting for them to catch up. The virus had opened the door to this truth. It had linked their consciousness to the future and the past, blurring the lines between what had happened and what would happen. It wasn't a disease, it was a revelation. The people in the room with him were no longer just infected. They were evolved. They were walking timelines, embodiments of what humanity would become. They were the conduits for the next phase of evolution, for the rise of a new world. The past, the present, and the future were all merging together, and the boundaries between them were becoming indistinct. Karen looked at him, her expression a mirror of his own. She was starting to understand too. She, too, was feeling the tug of the future, the pull toward something far greater than themselves. We can't stop this, she said, her voice barely a breath. Can we? Reeves shook his head. No. We never could. It was always part of the plan. We were always meant to be part of it. The woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward, her expression serene. You've come to understand what we have known for centuries. The virus was never an accident. It was a seed planted in time, waiting to bloom. And now it is blooming. But what about everyone else? Karen asked, her voice trembling. The people who aren't evolved? They will evolve, the woman replied, in time. The virus is already spreading. It will find them, just as it found you. But it's not just about their genes. It's about their minds, their consciousness. The future will make its way through them, just as it has through you. Reeves felt a strange calm settle over him. It was as though the tension that had gripped him for days, weeks, months had finally released its hold. There was no more fear. There was only the knowledge that this was the way things had always been meant to unfold. The world was changing. It was evolving. And they, as the carriers of the virus, had become the bridge between past and future. As he looked out the window again, the skyline had shifted, though nothing in the physical world had changed. The world was the same, yet not the same. The evolution was invisible, like the wind, unseen but ever present. In a few short weeks, everything would be different. But Reeves didn't fear it anymore. He understood now. The future had arrived, and with it, the ultimate truth. There was no going back, the future had already been written. They were simply living it, and in that moment, Dr. Reeves realized something even deeper. The future wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a time. It was a state of being, a way of existing outside the limitations of time itself, and the true evolution of humanity had just begun. End of story.